Welcome to the world behind midnight. Tonight's file originated from a Soviet-era research installation in the Ural Mountains. The installation was officially decommissioned in 1991. Officially, the Clan of Steel didn't hunt like animals. They hunted like soldiers, flanking movements, coordinated distraction, deliberate choke point control. Someone, at some point, had trained them. The Ural Mountains run for 2,500 kilometers across the spine of Russia, from the Arctic coast in the north to the Kazakh steppe in the south. They are not the tallest mountains in the world. They are not the most dramatic. What they are is old, older than the Alps, older than the Rockies, ground down by time to rounded ridges and broad valleys that hold the cold the way a stone wall holds damp. People have been mining these mountains for 4 centuries. Iron, copper, platinum, gold. The Urals gave Russia the materials to build the empire that eventually became the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union, with the particular enthusiasm it brought to the extraction of everything useful from the earth, dug deeper and further and harder than anyone before it. Some of those mines were officially documented, some were not. The complex designated UKV-7 appeared in no public registry. No environmental survey had ever been filed for it. The workers who had built it in the 1960s had been relocated after completion to locations that subsequent researchers were never able to confirm. The engineers who had designed it had, in the language of the era, ceased to be available for interview. What happened inside UKV-7 between 1964 and 1991 was classified at a level that required specific clearance, even within the Soviet intelligence apparatus. In October of 1991, the complex was sealed. The sealing was thorough. Blast doors. Concrete poured into the primary access tunnels. Official notation in whatever records existed that UKV-7 had been decommissioned. Its contents removed. Its purpose concluded. The program it had housed was listed as terminated 2 years earlier. Biological research, with military applications, classified above the standard Soviet clearance hierarchy, signed off by 4 separate ministries, whose names no longer existed in any current directory. In February of this year, a construction team working on a pipeline route 3 kilometers from the sealed entrance accidentally broke through into the upper ventilation system. The breach was small, 40 centimeters across, barely enough to admit a person. The foreman logged it, assessed structural risk as low, and moved on. 2 members of the construction crew, on their own initiative, entered the complex to assess the damage to the wall. They did not come back out. The authorities who responded found the ventilation breach. They found the equipment the 2 men had carried in. They found no other evidence of any kind. VEILBORN received the briefing 14 hours later. The insertion was different from the ridge in the Carpathians. No frozen forest clearing. No darkness and wind, and the sound of something ancient moving through the trees. The helicopter set them down on a gravel access road, beside a ventilation shaft that smelled of iron and decades of sealed air, under a gray Ural sky at 9:30 in the morning. Daylight, industrial surroundings, a landscape that had been worked and processed and extracted from tailings piles, access roads, the concrete foundations of structures that had been demolished rather than abandoned, the marks of a different kind of human activity than the forests of Karelia or the valleys of the Carpathians. Vanek had expected this to feel less wrong than those deployments. It did not. The wrongness here was different in character, not the organic, watching wrongness of old forest, but a mechanical wrongness, the feeling of a system that had been designed to contain something and had contained it for 30 years and was now open. They entered through the ventilation shaft breach. The interior of UKV-7 was intact. This was the first unexpected thing. Sealed complexes, in Vanek's experience, did not remain intact. They corroded, settled, flooded, collapsed under their own weight when the soil around them shifted and nobody was maintaining the drainage systems or checking the structural supports. 30 years of abandonment left marks on concrete and steel the way it left marks on everything. UKV-7 looked like it had been sealed last week. The emergency lighting was still operational, a dim red-orange that filled the corridors with the color of something not quite right. The equipment along the walls was dusty but undamaged. The Soviet-era instrumentation on the panels they passed had readings on it, not zeroed out, not powered down, reading, active, monitoring something that someone, or something, had maintained the power supply to monitor continuously for 3 decades. NARS was on her equipment from the first step inside. The signal was here, the same low-frequency pulse she had been tracking since the ridge. Stronger here than in the Carpathians, stronger here than anywhere she had logged it. It was not broadcasting from somewhere in the complex. It was emanating from the walls themselves, the way a place that has contained something for long enough eventually begins to carry its frequency in the stone, and it was coming from below. Vanek noted the depth markings on the corridor walls. They were going down to level 4. The claw marks began on level 2. Not at the entrance. Not in the upper corridors where the construction crew had broken through. Level 2, 40 meters below the surface, accessed via a stairwell that had been designed for functionality rather than aesthetics. Bare concrete walls and steel grate steps that rang under their boots with a sound that traveled further than it should have. The marks were at ceiling height. Vanek measured the reach required to produce them at somewhere between 9 and 10 feet. The depth of the gouges suggested significant force, not the casual marking of territory, but something that had been moving fast through this corridor and had used the walls to manage its speed. Shaw tracked the pattern. The marks were consistent, same anatomical signature throughout, same stride-to-impact ratio. One entity, moving through these corridors regularly, over what appeared to be an extended period of time. The dust around the lowest marks was disturbed recently. The dust around the highest marks had something had been living here for a long time. The archive room was on level 3, behind a blast door that had been secured from the outside, which meant it had been secured by whoever had sealed the complex, not by whatever was inside. It took Dragomir and Ionescu 11 minutes to get the door open. Neither of them spoke during those 11 minutes. The sounds from level 4, which had begun when they reached level 3 and had not stopped, were a steady subsonic presence that Nars's instruments were logging in real time, and that the human body was registering in older, less rational ways. Inside the archive room, filing cabinets in rows, thousands of documents, their edges yellowed, some of the folders brittle enough that Nars handled them in gloves to prevent them disintegrating at the touch. The light was better in here, a separate emergency circuit that had been sealed with the room and had, somehow, remained partially functional. She found the file in the 4th cabinet she searched. It was thicker than she had expected, much thicker. The folder was labeled with a date range from 1966 to 1989, 23 years of documentation. She weighed it in her hands for a moment before opening it. Then she sat down on the floor of the archive room, because the first page she read required more stability than standing provided, and she began to read. She did not speak for 22 minutes. Vague. The program had begun in 1966, 2 years after the complex was completed and operational. The premise, as documented in the opening sections of the file, was straightforward in the way that Soviet military research was frequently straightforward. A signal of biological origin had been detected by a monitoring station in the Kola Peninsula. The signal was not human in origin, not mechanical, not electromagnetic in any conventional sense. It appeared to be emitted by living tissue of a type that the instruments of the era could detect but not classify. The program's objective was to understand the signal's source, nature, and potential military applications. The early research was observation-based. Remote monitoring stations deployed across the northern Urals, signal triangulation, geographic mapping of source locations. The source locations clustered in areas of dense, old-growth forest. By 1971, the program had moved into a second phase. Nars did not read the second phase section out loud. She photographed every page instead, carefully, methodically, in the red-orange light of the archive room, while Vanek stood at the door and listened to the corridor outside. What she photographed was enough. The second phase involved subjects, human subjects, specifically selected for what the program documentation described as exposure tolerance, a characteristic that the researchers had identified empirically in a small percentage of the population and had not been able to explain theoretically. The subjects were exposed to the signal under controlled conditions. The results were documented in a section of the file that had been partially redacted even within this classified document. Pages with blocks of text obscured, data tables with columns removed, photographs with faces and identifying information covered. At the top of the results section, in large type, a single word: catastrophic. The archive room held something else that Nars did not immediately include in her operational report. In the bottom drawer of the 6th cabinet, behind a series of maintenance logs that had been filed chronologically and then, at some point, ceased, she found a set of photographs. Not surveillance photography, not technical documentation, personal photographs, the kind that people take to remember things, or to prove to themselves that they were really somewhere, really did something. They showed the interior of UKV-7 as it had been before the ceiling, equipment in operation, personnel at stations, the specific atmosphere of a classified facility in the Soviet era, the gray light, the institutional furniture, the particular combination of advanced technology and brutalist construction that the period had produced. In the background of 3 of the photographs, marks on the wall, not the marks from level 2, not the high urgent scoring of something moving fast through confined space. These were different, lower, more deliberate, the kind of marks made slowly, with intention. She looked at them for a long time. Then she photographed the photographs and added them to the archive under the same classification code she had been using throughout. She would return to them later, in a different context, with a different understanding of what she was looking at. For now, she filed them. The archive room door was still open behind her. The emergency lighting continued its dim work, and somewhere below them, in the levels they had not descended to, something moved with the slow, patient weight of something that has been in one place for a very long time and does not consider its time wasted. The subject files were in a separate cabinet, 47 folders, each one corresponding to a numbered subject designation. Most of the personal information had been removed, names replaced with codes, physical descriptions replaced with clinical measurements, histories replaced with intake assessments. Nars went through them quickly, looking for the anomaly that her intuition told her was there. She found it in the 23rd folder. Subject, designation, Falcon. The redaction in this file was less complete than the others, as if whoever had processed it had been in less of a hurry, or had considered this particular subject less sensitive than the rest. Blood type, O, positive. Age at intake, 28 years. Physical description, male, 186 centimeters, 79 kilograms. Dark hair, above-average physical conditioning. The intake date was not legible. The outcome section at the back of the folder had been removed entirely, not redacted, physically removed, the pages torn out, and not replaced. But the medical data in the middle of the file was intact. Nars studied it for a long time. Then she called Shaw over. He looked at the file. He looked at her. He looked at the file again, the photograph and the accompanying documentation. The subject designation Falcon printed on the divider page, in the same typeface as every other subject in the cabinet, as if it were routine, as if the designation referred to something ordinary. He said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would have made the situation better, and in Nars's experience, Shaw understood that well enough not to try. He had a quality she valued in field partners, the discipline to withhold reaction when reaction would not serve. He looked at the file, he understood its implications, and he filed the understanding somewhere in his operational consciousness to be processed later, when processing it wouldn't cost them anything. She photographed every remaining page in the folder, 67 pages in total. She filed the photographs under a temporary classification code that would expire in 48 hours if she did not renew it. She did not put the subject designation Falcon into the shared mission log. Not yet. Possibly not ever, depending on what the remaining pages of the archive contained and what they confirmed. She kept it, for now, in a file that only she could access. There were things you confirmed before you said out loud. There were things that, once said, could not be unsaid, and this was one of them. They found the clan on level 4, not by stumbling into them, by being led. The marks on the walls of the level 4 corridor were different from the ones above, less urgent, more deliberate. placed at intervals that suggested communication rather than transit. A language of marks that none of them could read, but that Dragomir spent 7 minutes studying before he said, carefully, that he thought it was directional. It was pointing them further in. Vanek made a decision that would have been difficult to justify in any operational framework he had been trained in. He followed the marks. The stillness of patience. Long practiced, institutional patience. The stillness of things that had been waiting in this chamber, in this complex, in these mountains, for a very long time. The decision to follow the marks had felt, at the time, like the most irrational operational choice Vanek had made since the ridge. He had been making those choices regularly since then. He had also been right about them regularly since then, which he noted in the part of his mind that tracks such things, because the sample size was approaching significance, and the implication was one he was not yet ready to address directly. They led to a chamber, a large space that had originally been some kind of equipment storage area, the heavy machinery long since removed, the floor bare concrete, the ceiling high enough that the creatures standing along its walls were not constrained by it. They were gray, not the silver gray of the Carpathian clan, but a darker gray, the color of old iron, shot through with black in irregular patterns that varied from one individual to the next. They were stockier than any clan Vanek had encountered, built for confined spaces, for the kind of movement that requires power over range. Their eyes and the red runge emergency lighting were a deep, dark amber. There were 7 of them. They were not blocking the way in. They had been waiting. The quality of stillness in that chamber was different from anything Vanek had encountered on the ridge or in the Carpathians. Not the stillness of assessment or of withheld action, the stillness of patience. Long practiced, institutional patience. The stillness of things that had been waiting in this chamber, in this complex, in these mountains, for a very long time. The decision to follow the marks had felt, at the time, like the most irrational operational choice Vanek had made since the ridge. He had been making those choices regularly since then. He had also been right about them regularly since then, which he noted in the part of his mind that tracks such things, because the sample size was approaching significance, and the implication was one he was not yet ready to address directly. He followed the marks. The chamber they led to was not on any map of UKV-7 that he had been able to locate in the archive room, which either meant the map was incomplete or the chamber had been constructed after the original documentation. The construction looked original, the same concrete mixture, the same pore pattern, an omission. Then, someone had decided this chamber should not appear on the official record. Someone had decided, simultaneously, to stock it with a clan of creatures that had apparently been living here, in the dark, for 30 years. The specific someone behind both decisions was not named anywhere in the file. The specific someone, Vanek suspected, was not the kind of person who put their name on things. The stillness of patience, long practiced, institutional patience. The stillness of things that had been waiting in this chamber, in this complex, in these mountains, for a very long time. The decision to follow the marks had felt, at the time, like the most irrational operational choice Vanek had made since the ridge. He had been making those choices regularly since then. He had also been right about them regularly since then, which he noted in the part of his mind that tracks such things, because the sample size was approaching significance, and the implication was one he was not yet ready to address directly. Dragomir did something that nobody had briefed him to do, and that nobody had the authority to stop. He put his weapon on the ground. Not as a gesture of surrender. He set it down with the careful, deliberate placement of a man who has decided that the object is no longer the appropriate tool for the situation. He straightened up. He stood with his hands open at his sides. Then he knelt. Not in submission, Vanek understood the distinction immediately, though he could not have articulated what made it clear. The posture was not the posture of someone acknowledging defeat. It was the posture of someone acknowledging something much older than defeat. Respect offered to a thing that had been present long before the person offering it was born, and that would be present long after. The 7 creatures in the chamber were completely still. The largest, standing toward the back, which Vanek was already interpreting as a spatial hierarchy indicator, shifted its weight slightly. Then the circle opened. A path appeared between the creatures along the left wall, leading to the far end of the chamber and the corridor beyond. Not because anyone had moved aside, because the arrangement had changed. The way a conversation changes when someone decides to extend an invitation rather than continue an interrogation. The creatures on either side of the corridor were not retreating, they were acknowledging. The distinction was significant, and Dragomir had been the one to create it, through 20 minutes of stillness and posture, and the kind of direct eye contact that most people's instincts would have described as suicide, but that Dragomir seemed to understand was the only currency that worked here. Dragomir stood up. He looked at Vanek. His expression said, "Now." His expression also said, smoothly, no sudden movements, no weapons raised, no acknowledgement of the fact that this was one of the more unusual negotiations any of them had participated in. Vanek had the unsettling experience of standing in a Soviet weapons complex, 40 meters underground, watching a Romanian tracker negotiate passage with a group of creatures that a 23-year classified weapons program had tried and failed to control, using only posture and silence, and realizing that it had worked, that the program had failed precisely because it had never understood what Dragomir had understood in 40 minutes. He picked up Dragomir's weapon from where he had set it down, and handed it back to him quietly. They walked through the open corridor in single file. The creatures watched them leave. None of them followed. They emerged from UKV-7 at 1422 into gray Ural daylight, carrying 4 duffel bags of photographed archive material and a silence that none of them were ready to break. The complex was resealed behind them. Not permanently. The breach in the ventilation system would require a dedicated team and specialized equipment to close properly. And that team would have questions that nobody wanted to answer directly, but sealed enough for the immediate purpose. In the helicopter, Nars organized her photographs. She worked methodically, the way she always worked, sorting by document type and date rather than by significance. Because significance was something you assessed after you had the complete picture rather than in the middle of acquiring it. She had been working for 11 minutes when she stopped. She sat back against the helicopter wall and stared at the ceiling for a moment. Then she said, without preamble, to the general air of the cabin, "The signal in the UKV-7 complex and the signal I recorded on the Karelian Ridge and in the Carpathians are identical. Not similar, identical. Same frequency, same modulation pattern, same biological signature architecture." The Soviet program detected this signal in 1966. The Soviet program classified its source as biological, unknown origin, unknown entity. They spent 25 years trying to understand it and documented their results under the category catastrophic. She looked at Van. "The same signal," she said. "The same source. Across 3 countries and 30 years of human investigation. Whatever this is," she said, "it was here a long time before any of us started looking for it." Nobody in the helicopter responded, because nobody had an answer to that, and the ones they might have offered were worse than the silence. The helicopter back to the staging city flew through a brief window of clear weather that opened over the Ural foothills for 30 minutes, and then closed again, the cloud cover returning with the unhurried persistence of Ural autumn. Vanek looked at the mountains below. They were, from altitude, exactly what the physical geography references described them as: old, rounded, unremarkable. The kind of mountains that had been everything once, the spine of a continent, the source of materials that had funded empires, and had become, over time, simply landscape, background, except that in the rock beneath those rounded ridges, a complex had been built, and sealed and kept, and inside the complex something had been waiting with a patience that made the patience of human institutions look provisional. He thought about the file. He thought about 25 years of Soviet research, reaching the single-word conclusion, catastrophic, not because the research had failed, because it had succeeded. The Soviet files were extracted and classified above top secret within 72 hours of VEILBORN's return. Dragomir's translation of the feeding schedule wall markings was redacted from the official report. He kept a photograph. The clan of steel remains in the Ural facility. Thermal satellite confirms ongoing activity. The facility perimeter has been expanded. Not by VEILBORN, not by NATO, not by any agency that has responded to inquiry. Something expanded it from the inside. Subscribe to The World Behind Midnight to uncover the next operation before it disappears, because some secrets are best left behind midnight.